Hi, Nicholas Sperling here. Welcome back to my channel. Today, let's talk about non-binary erasure. Too often, we see non-binary people left out of conversations around trans issues, and that's just not okay. We obviously have a lot of trans men and a lot of trans women, and we have issues that we need to discuss, but let's always try to include non-binary folks in the conversation because it's a group of trans people that often go unnoticed. And just a point here too, trans women in general tend to be the focus because trans men also get ignored, and that's something that also needs to change. But today we're talking non-binary erasure, so let's get into this video. To start with, let's talk about what it means to be non-binary. And I'm going to speak as someone who understands the concept, but who doesn't experience what it's like to be non-binary. I am not a non-binary person. I'm a trans woman. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this video because I'm not speaking on behalf of non-binary people. I'm simply trying to amplify the voices of non-binary people and bring attention to the fact that too often we participate in non-binary erasure. So being non-binary means that you don't fit onto the two binary ends of the spectrum of gender, meaning you don't identify as a man and you don't identify as a woman. You fit somewhere in between or completely off the chart altogether. Your gender is potentially fluid. It's potentially encompassing multiple genders. I'm not going to again speak for how every non-binary person views their gender, but I will put up this graphic right here, and that is the gender unicorn. It gives you a sense of the differences between your sex assigned at birth, your gender identity, your gender expression, your sexual orientation, whether that is romantic or physical, and hopefully it gives you a better understanding of the spectrum that is gender identity and gender expression. Many non-binary people use the pronouns they, them, theirs, but that's not to say that every non-binary person is going to use those pronouns. As with anyone, make sure that you're checking which pronouns a person wants you to use for them out of respect. It's a really good way to introduce yourself to a person and then you know moving forward what pronouns to use unless they tell you otherwise. As with all trans people, non-binary people face discrimination in society, and a lack of societal acceptance among trans people leads to the extremely high suicide rates that we see. The way that we solve this is obviously, as a society, becoming more accepting of trans people. Now, the erasure of non-binary people means that that acceptance is not there in the way that it is for trans men and trans women, and we don't necessarily even have a lot of acceptance for trans men and trans women. However, for non-binary people, it's even less, and that's part of why when we're having conversations around trans people, it's really important that we include non-binary people in those conversations. So much of our language is gendered, and English less so than some other languages, but still, we use gender in so many aspects of our lives. And in some cases, it's not inclusive of trans people, but in some cases, it's not even inclusive of women. And you'll notice that in contract documents, in instructions for board games, in a variety of different aspects where he will be used to represent all genders. And they is a much more appropriate way to encompass all genders because rather than saying he or she, they encompasses he, she, and anyone who has another gender identity. A lot of studies out there don't actually include trans people. They will allow you to identify as a man, as a woman, and sometimes as other. But the reality is that when you're going through statistics, you don't know if a person is trans or not, and you're not able to apply the results of a study towards helping trans people if you can't actually identify them. Now, this poses concerns in other aspects in terms of privacy for trans people, but the fact of the matter is that trans people, and in particular non-binary people, are often ignored when it comes to various studies. In the workplace, you are expected to dress a certain way. And if you are a man, you have stereotypical clothing that you're expected to wear. If you're a woman, you have stereotypical clothing that you're expected to wear. Here in Canada, you're not actually allowed to force a person to dress according to the stereotypes for a woman or the stereotypes for a man. You can put forward a dress code, And if the person decides they want to wear the women's dress code, they can. If they decide they want to wear the men's dress code, they can. But the problem with non-binary folks is they don't often want to adhere to one or the other because that doesn't fit with their identity or their gender expression. When they go off script, as it were, and wear clothing that is comfortable for them and that matches their gender identity and gender expression, they're often viewed as unprofessional because they're not fitting into the stereotypical workplace clothing, even though it might meet the actual requirements of the dress code between the men's and the women's version. What do non-binary people do when it comes to washrooms? It's very easy for a trans woman or a trans man to know which washroom they should use. They use the washroom that corresponds with their gender. And there are obviously issues that arise when it comes with that because people don't necessarily want trans people using the washroom. And people can become very violent. But the reality is the trans people themselves know which washroom they're supposed to be using. When it comes to non-binary folks, that's not the case. As a non-binary person, you look at the men's washroom and the women's washroom and you think, well, neither one of those really fits. Not every place is going to have an all-gender restroom. Not every place is going to have a single stall restroom. And non-binary people are put in the position of having to choose one or the other. And when they go in, if they're not perceived as the gender that is listed on the door to that washroom, they can face harassment, they can face violence. So it's a very dangerous position to put someone in, and it's not easily solved because we have these instances of gendered washrooms in society at large. There are a lot of them. And this is just something that we need to educate the public about because I would really love to see all gender washrooms. From a security standpoint, you have single stalls for all of the washrooms, full height doors with locks. So you don't have to worry nearly as much about threats in the washroom. You have full privacy in there. The only time you're interacting with other people is when you're going to wash your hands. I also love this as someone who works in construction because I know that the cost to build a gender-neutral washroom is a lot lower than having to build two washrooms, and the plumbing costs are a lot less because you don't have to split the plumbing and send it off to two different rooms. As with all trans people, non-binary people face a significant amount of challenges when it comes to accessing healthcare. Sometimes that can include not being provided with care, being discriminated against while care is being provided, being misgendered, or having the wrong identification placed on their wristband. A lot of the time, the reason people don't talk about non-binary folks is because they don't understand non-binary folks. I think people can understand what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man. They might not understand what it's like to actually be a trans person, or understand why you might want to change your gender as they would view it in their eyes. But with non-binary people, there's this whole other level of confusion, which is, what is that? What is a non-binary gender? But so many people just write off non-binary people because they don't understand what it's like to be non-binary, in the same way that many cis people will write off trans people. And it becomes one of those never-ending cycles of a marginalized group wanting recognition, but also marginalizing other groups at the same time. And it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Why would someone that's gone through being marginalized want to marginalize another group? The thing is, we don't have to understand what it's like to be non-binary in order to provide people with acceptance and respect. And that's what non-binary people deserve. They also deserve to have their voices amplified by us. And that's something that I think is extremely important in all of the conversations that we're having, because all trans women seem to be getting a lot of attention, whether good or bad, because we are typically the ones being attacked. Trans men and non-binary people are just completely left out of the conversation. And I think that trans women are doing a pretty good job of trying to include trans men in conversations. We just need to do more of that because we're not doing it enough. But when it comes to non-binary people, I think both trans women and trans men need to do much more work in terms of amplifying the voices of non-binary people because they are even further marginalized than we are. And it's extremely important that we provide them with a voice and allow people to understand that non-binary is a thing and that non-binary people deserve to be respected. They deserve the same rights as everyone else. And I think it goes without saying that everyone deserves to have equal rights. But in a lot of cases, that just doesn't happen. So it's up to us to make sure that people who are being treated inequitably are boosted up. And that's going to be the role of us because as a binary trans people, we have a certain level of privilege, just as cis people have a certain level of privilege and should be using that to amplify trans voices as well. So I hope this made some sense to you, and I hope that you will do some more research, because I am not an expert on what it's like to be non-binary. I simply want to make sure that we are talking about the erasure of non-binary people, because I don't think there's much attention being placed on this at the moment. So please go do your research. Go look up what it means to be non-binary. Maybe find some non-binary people in your life that you can talk to if they're willing. And please help raise the profile of non-binary people. If you enjoy this kind of content, please hit the like button. If you want to see more content like this, please hit the subscribe button and hit the bell icon so you get notified every time I post a new video. And until next time, have a great day.